Welcome to the deep dive.
Right.
Today we're going deep into embryological anatomy, critical for any plastic surgery resident prepping for the FRCS exam.
Right.
We'll cover pharyngeal arches, facial development, and those high-yield facts about the thyroid tongue and external ear.
That's going to be a good one.
Consider this your targeted review, hitting the must-know areas to help you ace that exam.
Absolutely. So we'll start with a quick review of the three germ layers.
Okay.
Ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm.
Yep.
Each gives rise to specific tissues you'll encounter every day in plastic surgery.
Right.
Skin, bone, muscle, and more.
It's amazing how these simple layers form the foundation for such complex structures. And within the ectoderm, we have those remarkable neural crest cells.
Yes, these cells are key players. They're pluripotent, meaning they can differentiate into various tissues influencing the development of surrounding structures. Think of them as the master builders of the face and neck.
So now let's move on to pharyngeal arches, sometimes called branchial arches, which are crucial for understanding craniofacial development.
These arches form from neural crest cells migrating into areas of the developing head and neck that contain endoderm and mesoderm.
Okay.
For the exam, remember that pharyngeal arches are distinct from somites, which are mesodermal swellings around the neural tube.
So how many pharyngeal arches are there?
Typically, there are 6, but the first 4 are the most clinically relevant. Each arch has 4 key components.
Okay.
A nerve, an artery, a muscle, and a skeletal element.
Got it.
And here's a crucial point. The original muscle innervations are maintained even as these structures migrate during development.
That's definitely a high-yield fact to remember. You can often predict the nerve supply to a structure based on its embryological origin.
Precisely. Now let's break down the derivatives of each of the first 4 arches. Knowing these is absolutely essential for the FRCS.
Okay.
The first arch gives rise to the muscles of mastication, including the temporalis masseter and pterygoids. It also forms 2 of the middle ear ossicles, the malleus and ingussus.
What nerve innervates these structures?
The first arch is innervated by the trigeminal nerve, or cranial nerve, V. Moving to the second arch, it forms the muscles of facial expression, such as the frontalis orbicularis oculi and orbicularis oris. It also contributes to the styloid process of the temporal bone, the stapes of the middle ear, and a portion of the hyoid bone.
This arch is innervated by?
The facial nerve, or cranial nerve, fixity. Now for the third arch, this arch forms a portion of the hyoid bone and the stylopharyngeus muscle.
Which cranial nerve corresponds to the third arch?
The glossopharyngeal nerve, or cranial nerve, 9X. Finally, the fourth arch.
Okay.
This arch gives rise to several laryngeal cartilages, including the thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, and arytenoid cartilages. It also contributes to the formation of certain pharyngeal muscles.
And the nerve we need to know for this arch?
The vagus nerve, cranial nerve X. For the exam, you should focus on the structures in the source materials table, 19:1, particularly those in bold as these are frequently tested.
Now let's talk about the pharyngeal grooves and pouches. The first groove is the only one that persists in the adult.
That's right. And it develops into the external auditory canal. The mesoderm associated with the first groove forms the tympanic membrane.
What happens to the other grooves?
The second, third, and fourth grooves normally disappear completely during development. However, if they fail to obliterate, they can lead to the formation of pharyngeal cleft cysts, sinuses, or fistulas.
These anomalies are often detected later in childhood or adulthood. Where are they typically found?
They are typically found along the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Anomalies arising from the second groove are the most common and run beneath the sternocleidomastoid muscle over the glossopharyngeal nerve and between the external and internal carotid arteries towards the tonsillar fossa. Understanding their anatomical relationships is crucial for diagnosis and surgical management.
Each of the first 4 pouches also gives rise to important structures.
That's right. The first pouch develops into the internal auditory canal, also known as the eustachian tube, which connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx. The second pouch forms the palatine tonsils, which are part of the lymphatic system and play a role in immunity.
What about the third and fourth pouches?
The third pouch differentiates into the inferior parathyroid glands and the thymus. The inferior parathyroid glands play a crucial role in calcium regulation, while the thymus is essential for the development of the immune system. The fourth pouch differentiates into the superior parathyroid glands, which also play a role in calcium regulation.
And there's a fascinating developmental twist here.
Indeed. During development, the fourth pouch actually migrates above the third pouch, which explains why the superior parathyroid glands end up located higher in the neck than the inferior parathyroid glands. Surgeons need to be aware of this during procedures in this region.
The fifth pouch also has a crucial role.
Yes, it forms a structure called the ultimobranchial body, which contributes to the development of the parafollicular or C cells of the thyroid gland. These cells produce the hormone calcitonin, which is involved in calcium homeostasis.
Let's switch gears now and discuss bone formation. This is another important area for the FRCS exam. There are two main processes, intramembranous and endochondral ossification.
Intramembranous ossification is where mesenchymal cells directly differentiate into osteoblasts. This process is responsible for the formation of flat bones, like the bones of the skull vault.
What about endochondral ossification?
Endochondral ossification involves the formation of a cartilaginous template that is gradually replaced by bone. This process is responsible for the formation of most long bones, like the femur and humerus.
Both processes are involved in craniofacial development.
Mm.
The cranium itself is divided into two parts: the neurocranium, which encases and protects the brain, and the viscerocranium, which forms the facial skeleton.
The neurocranium is further divided into the membranous neurocranium, which forms by intramembranous ossification and includes bones like the frontal parietal and upper occipital bones. Then there's the cartilaginous neurocranium, which forms by endochondral ossification and includes bones like the ethmoid sphenoid and the base of the occipital bone.
And the viscerocranium?
The viscerocranium, or facial skeleton, forms primarily via intramembranous ossification from the first pharyngeal arch. An exception is Meckel's cartilage, which forms by endochondral ossification and contributes to the development of the malleus and mandibular condyles.
Now let's talk about the development of the face. It originates from 5 prominences.
That's right. The face develops from the frontonasal prominence, the paired maxillary prominences, and the paired mandibular prominences.
Okay.
Let's start with the frontonasal prominence.
Okay.
It gives rise to the forehead, the nasal dorsum, and the medial and lateral nasal prominences.
What about the nasal placodes?
The nasal placodes, which are thickenings of the ectoderm, develop into the nasal pits.
Yeah.
Initially, these pits are in contact with the stomodium, but are later separated as the face develops.
Okay.
Diverticula from the lateral walls of the nasal pits extend into the surrounding bones to form the paranasal sinuses.
So the nasal pits eventually form the nares or nostrils. And the medial and lateral nasal prominences contribute to specific facial structures.
The medial nasal prominence forms the primary palate, the mid-portion of the maxilla, the mid-portion of the upper lip, the philtrum, the central portion of the nose, and the nasal septum. The lateral nasal prominences form the nasal alae.
The maxillary prominences also undergo significant medial migration during development.
They do. As they migrate medially, they contribute to the formation of the secondary palate, the lateral portions of the maxilla, and the lateral portions of the upper lip. This migration separates the nasal pits from the stomodium, leading to distinct nasal and oral cavities.
What happens at the junction between the maxillary prominences and the lateral nasal prominences?
This junction forms the nasolacrimal groove and the nasolacrimal duct system, which drains tears from the eyes into the nasal cavity. Failure of fusion in this area can result in an oblique facial cleft.
And lastly, the mandibular prominences.
The mandibular prominences fuse medially to form the mandible, the lower lip, and the lower portion of the face. It's important to remember that facial development is a complex process regulated by numerous growth factors and signaling pathways. Disruptions in these pathways can lead to various craniofacial anomalies.
Let's shift gears and discuss the development of the mouth and palate. The mouth begins to develop with the formation of the stomodium.
Correct. This stomodium is initially separated from the primitive pharynx by the buccopharyngeal membrane, but this membrane eventually breaks down, allowing communication between the stomodium and the pharynx.
And the palate develops in 2 stages.
Yes. The primary palate forms first from the fusion of the medial nasal prominences. It contributes to the anterior portion of the hard palate, the premaxilla, and the portion of the alveolar ridge containing the incisor teeth. The secondary palate forms later from shelves of tissue that grow from the maxillary prominences.
These shelves elevate to a horizontal position, eventually fusing with the nasal septum and the primary palate.
That's right. Incomplete fusion of these structures can lead to cleft palate, which is a common congenital anomaly.
Are there other important structures in this region for the exam?
Yes, the incisive foramen lies between the primary and secondary palates and transmits nerves and blood vessels to the anterior palate. Epstein's pearls are small white cysts, sometimes seen along the median rife of the palate. They are caused by cystic degeneration of epithelial remnants.
And nasopalatine duct cysts.
These occur in the midline of the anterior palate near the incisive foramen. They arise from epithelial remnants of the nasopalatine duct, which connects the oral cavity to the nasal cavity during embryonic development.
Now let's move on to the development of the thyroid gland.
The thyroid gland develops from an endodermal thickening in the floor of the primitive pharynx in the region of the foramen cecum. From this origin, the thyroid descends in the neck, following the thyroglossal duct to its final position in front of the trachea.
So the thyroid migrates from the tongue down to its final position in the neck.
Exactly. Remnants of the thyroglossal duct can persist, leading to thyroglossal duct cysts, the most common congenital anomaly of the thyroid gland.
How do these cysts typically present?
They typically present as painless midline neck masses that move upward with swallowing or protrusion of the tongue. This movement is because the thyroglossal duct is attached to the hyoid bone.
Now let's discuss the development of the tongue. It arises from contributions from multiple pharyngeal arches.
Yes, the anterior two-thirds of the tongue originates from the first pharyngeal arch. The posterior third originates from the third and fourth pharyngeal arches.
So the different parts of the tongue have different nerve supplies.
That's right. The anterior two-thirds of the tongue is innervated by the lingual nerve, a branch of the trigeminal nerve for general sensation, and by the chorda tympani, a branch of the facial nerve for taste. The posterior third is innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve for both general sensation and taste, and by the vagus nerve for a small area at the very back.
Finally, let's talk about the development of the external ear. It develops from tissues derived from the first and second pharyngeal arches.
The first arch gives rise to the tragus, the root of the helix, and the superior portion of the helix. The second arch contributes to the antitragus, the antihelix, and the lobule of the ear. These six helix fuse and grow to form the shape of the external ear.
And the external auditory canal.
The external auditory canal develops from the first pharyngeal groove. The ear develops in the neck region and gradually ascends to its final position. If this ascent is interrupted, it can result in microsuchia, where the ear is smaller than normal and positioned lower on the head.
Let's move on to discussing craniofacial anomalies. Many of these conditions arise from disruptions in the normal developmental processes we've just discussed.
That's right. Understanding embryology is crucial for diagnosing and managing these anomalies. Let's start with craniosanostosis. This is a condition where one or more of the cranial sutures fuse prematurely.
What causes this premature fusion?
The exact cause isn't always clear, but genetic factors play a role. Mutations in genes involved in fibroblast growth factor receptor signaling and transforming growth factor beta receptor signaling are commonly associated with craniosanostosis.
And how does craniosanostosis affect skull growth?
The skull grows in response to brain growth. When a suture fuses prematurely, growth perpendicular to that suture is restricted, leading to skull deformities. For example, if the sagittal suture fuses prematurely, the skull will become long and narrow, a condition known as scaphocephaly.
So the shape of the skull deformity depends on which suture is affected.
Precisely. Virchow's law states that after a suture fuses, growth proceeds parallel to the suture instead of perpendicular to it. This helps explain the patterns of skull growth seen in different types of craniosanostosis.
Now let's move on to facial clefts, which occur due to failures in the fusion of the facial prominences.
Cleft lip occurs when the medial nasal prominence fails to fuse properly with the maxillary prominence. This can occur unilaterally or bilaterally. Cleft palate can involve the primary palate, the secondary palate, or both.
And there are other less common types of facial clefts.
An oblique facial cleft results from a failure of fusion between the maxillary prominence and the lateral nasal prominence. A cleft at the lateral oral commissure results from a failure of fusion between the maxillary and mandibular prominences.
And are there any clefts that affect the midline of the face?
Yes. Though rare, median cleft lip results from a failure of the medial nasal prominences to fuse properly. Similarly, central defects of the lower lip and chin can result from a failure of the mandibular prominences to merge.
Wow. It's incredible how these complex facial structures develop from those initial prominences. And it's clear how disruptions in these processes can lead to various anomalies. This knowledge is essential for plastic surgeons preparing for the FRCS exam.
It is. Understanding the embryological basis of these conditions is crucial for proper diagnosis, treatment planning, and surgical management. Now let's revisit some of the key takeaways from our deep dive, emphasizing what's clinically relevant for plastic surgeons.
Okay, let's start with the pharyngeal arches. Understanding where these structures originate helps us predict their adult anatomy and any potential variations.
Absolutely. For instance, knowing that the first pharyngeal arch gives rise to the muscles of mastication and is innervated by the trigeminal nerve helps explain why conditions affecting this arch, such as Treacher-Collins syndrome, can result in underdeveloped jaw bones and facial muscles.
And the second pharyngeal arch.
The second arch forms the muscles of facial expression and is innervated by the facial nerve. So conditions like Mobius syndrome, which affects the facial nerve, can lead to facial paralysis.
What about those pharyngeal grooves and pouches? They seemed a bit tricky to keep straight.
They can be.
Hmm.
Remember that the first groove becomes the external auditory canal, and the second, third, and fourth grooves normally obliterate during development. If they don't, they can lead to pharyngeal cleft cysts, sinuses, or fistulas, typically located along the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle.
Right. And those pouches have so many important derivatives. It's like a cascade of development.
It is. The first pouch forms the internal auditory canal, the second forms the palatine tonsils, the third forms the inferior parathyroid glands, and thymus, the fourth, forms the superior parathyroid glands, and the fifth contributes to the thyroid gland.
The thyroid's journey is quite remarkable, starting in the tongue and then descending to the neck.
Indeed. And remnants of that descent path, the thyroglossal duct, can form cysts anywhere along the way. Knowing this developmental path helps us understand the presentation of these cysts. They often present as midline neck masses that move upward with swallowing.
The tongue is another example of complex development with contributions from multiple pharyngeal arches.
The anterior two-thirds is from the first arch, innervated by the trigeminal nerve for sensation and the facial nerve for taste. The posterior third is from the third and fourth arches, innervated by the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves.
And finally, the external ear. It's amazing how those 6 little hillocks from the first and second arches become such an intricate structure.
And remembering that the ear develops in the neck region and then ascends helps explain why conditions like microtia often present with a lower ear position. We've covered a vast amount of information, but what are the absolute must-knows for the FRCS exam?
Focus on the specific structures derived from each pharyngeal arch and their innervations. This is a high-yield area for exam questions.
Exactly. If you see a question about a structure in the head and neck, try to recall which pharyngeal arch it originated from. That will often give you clues about its blood supply, nerve supply, and potential developmental anomalies.
This has been an incredibly informative session. Any final thoughts for our listeners before they tackle the FRCS exam?
Remember, embryology is not just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the story of how we develop, and this understanding can be incredibly powerful in diagnosing and treating patients. As you continue your studies, consider this. How might understanding the molecular pathways involved in craniofacial development lead to new therapeutic approaches for congenital anomalies? Best of luck on your exam.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into embryological anatomy. We'll catch you on the next one.